Welcome to the session on developing referencing skills by Dr. Nick Wilmore. Today we're going to be looking at referencing. It's one of those subjects that people do seem to struggle with, and I'm sometimes not always sure why, because it is a question of following a set of rules rigidly and being clear about what it is you're trying to tell the reader. So it's going to be very much a talk and chalk session today, I'm afraid. There's going to be lots of slides and not a lot of me, because what I'm trying to do is show you a range of different styles within the Harvard system that's appropriate to different types of reference sources, whether they be academic journals or books, whether they be web pages and blogs, or, and this is more recently that has confused the system slightly, ebooks and e-archived material, particularly government sources. So I'm going to try and do a whistle-stop tour through it all, and I'm going to finish up just really flagging up for you the value of things like the reference managers that you can find online or incorporated in the paid-for Microsoft Word package. I will be doing another session specifically around the use of Microsoft Word's reference manager, but I'm not going to do that today because that would just make too much in one package. Okay, so the objective for this session is going to be about how do we become comfortable using Harvard, and more importantly understanding what a referencing system is intending to achieve. It's being clear about the different styles of publication and how they should be referenced, and ultimately to become comfortable with the different options that you might be asked to use. Please don't get frightened by the mystique of referencing. It really is a very straightforward, rules-based approach. I'm going to be using Harvard, and in particular the version put forward by Cite Them Right, which is an online reference portal. And that's because it is becoming something that a number of universities are using. You can use it either as a freebie, or if your university signs up to it, you can actually get the paid for elements to it. And that does help in as much as it can create the references for you in the same way that a reference manager would do. So without much more ado, let's move on and start thinking about what referencing means to you. So you have chosen your source material and identified what type of publication it is. When you come to the in-text citation style though, you will find they're all pretty much the same. That what they're looking for is the name of the lead author or lead organisation and the date of that publication. And the idea is that that is to help the reader identify which of the entries in your reading list you're referring to. So you might be talking about direct payments and making a comment and then citing Glasby 2016 as where that comment came from. Or equally, you might be saying that Glasby says that direct payments were a good thing, in which case you want to actually put his name outside the brackets because you're actually referring to John's comments. The point being that it's an element of common sense, but what you're trying to do is help the reader understand whether you're directly summarising what they're saying or using their observations to support your own. You might find you've got a report, an article with multiple authors. So in that case, you don't want to be putting all 20 different authors in. it's perfectly acceptable to use the phrase Osborne, the name of the lead author, et al., to indicate there are others, and then the date. The idea being, again, that can take you back to your reading list where they can see Osborne as the first name and then see who all the other names were in that reading list. And in the same way as with the simple style, you might have Osborne et al. 2011 in one set of brackets, or you might have them the name outside with just the date in the brackets as part of a more direct quotation. Legislation is if you're working within a single jurisdiction, for instance working within England or working in Scotland, it's perfectly acceptable just to put the title of the act and its date. Be careful with the dates, because sometimes you may have the same title and it be amended subsequently. So for instance, the Mental Health Act, you could have 1983, but you could also have 2007. You may also have multiple sources, and it's a good way of showing you're reading round the subject, or that an author has kept coming back to the subject. And on this occasion, I've used the example of Glasby 2016 and then Glasby and Needham 2019, which shows that Glasby keeps coming back to a discussion around citizenship and direct payments. The key point in all of this, that your in-text citation is your signpost for the reader to identify the correct material in your reading list at the end of the piece of work that you are submitting. The starting point, as always, is choosing what sort of reference it is that you're looking to identify. So on the slide here you see I've identified 4 that we're most likely to use in a social work course, which is books or ebooks, journals, electronic sources, and more recently electronic copies of reviews or policy papers. I'm not going to look at audio-visual or other art-based media on the basis that we rarely use them, and if you do, it's one of those where you're probably better off looking into your library's guide as to how they want you to do it, because you're not going to be doing it that often. So choosing your reference type. You've got books and ebooks, enough said for those. We'll look at the detail in a minute. Journals. These are the gold standard for any sort of academic work. So they normally come in published documents like the British Journal of Social Work, the Journal of Social Work, Performance Improvement Quarterly. Usually it says in it that there's a journal, or it says it's peer reviewed as part of the introduction to the document. And they're what you find most academic work is published in. It's where a lot of the more recent stuff is that you will find, because journals have a faster turnaround than it is a book. Thirdly, you've got electronic sources. This is a wide range of options, whether it's web pages, magazine articles, blogs. They're not peer reviewed, but some of them, like Community Care, are written for a professional audience, albeit often not with a degree of academic rigour that you would anticipate a journal to have. Alternatively, you might find somewhere like Research in Practice, who will bring together a mixture of professionally written articles and research articles that have been peer reviewed and published elsewhere. So Research in Practice is one where there's a lot of good material, but you need to be critical in terms of what you're using, whether you use it as a gateway to look for the source documents or whether it's got the source documents there. And finally, you have, in amongst electronic sources, a wide range of websites some of them from interest groups, some of them from professional organisations. Again, you need to have your critical faculties around. What is it that they're trying to sell you? If it's something like Mind or the NSPCC, they are a professionally led organisation, but they also have an advocacy and campaigning arm to their organisation, and it's up to you to work out which bit of their organisation they are promoting at that particular moment. And then you've got electronic copies of reviews or policy papers. This is something that's really come out in the last 5 years, with most government documents and policy papers appearing only as electronic archives. So you often will find those don't have authors. They will appear on either academic or government websites. They've not been peer reviewed. They are about developing public policy, so they won't have been peer reviewed, and they are likely to be advocating a particular agenda, either politically or intellectually. And I've given you a couple of examples there of ones that might appear as that. So you have to be very clear about what is your reference type, because that then impacts how you're going to reference it. The next group that I want to look at are books. The most traditional and in some ways the easiest to reference. You will be familiar with already the idea that the in-text citation, you've got the author and the date. When you come to the reference list, again it's the author, the date, the title of the publication, where it was published, and who by. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and it's the one that most people get right, I'll be honest with you. So what you should get would look like this. So the worked example that we've got here is the set book that we use for the course, which is Barbara Theatre. The date, the Introduction to Social Work Theory and Concepts. On this occasion, that it's the 4th edition, where it was published and who by. And in text, you would see that as Theatre 2014, with the brackets either around the whole lot or around the date, as I explained earlier. Where we sometimes get people having problems is if it's a chapter within a book. So on this occasion, you might have Joshua Conrad, who may have created a chapter, and on that basis you identify what the chapter is. Potentially, if it's been published elsewhere, you might have a separate date for it, but then you've got to say that it's in Theatre and the full detail of the book, including the page number. And in the text, that would appear as Conrad's 2013, because Conrad is the start of that line, so when the reader is scanning the reading list, they will be able to pick it up quickly. So for books, make sure you got the author, the date, the title, who and where it was published by. That's absolutely key. It allows you then, the reader, to then track that book and identify where you get your ideas from. Over the last couple of years, I've started using ebooks a lot more than I have hard copy books, partly because I can get hold of them quickly. I can get an ebook downloaded from Amazon in a couple of minutes, rather than having to wait for the university library to send it out and therefore lose my train of thought by 3 or 4 weeks. So there are some advantages to ebooks. I would very much use them because it happens to suit my working style. So when referencing them, it's very much the same as you would a book, in as much as you start off with the author's name, date, title, but you identify that as being online. You're still required to put in where it was published, so in this case New York, and the publisher, which is Routledge, and then a link to where you picked it up. And you can see on this occasion I've got the link to the Open University Library, but there are times where you're picking things up from an electronic marketplace and you may not be able to do that, but you do need to identify it as an online publication. Now, if you're going to be using an electronic reader, they don't always have the same page numbering systems that you would have on a hard copy. And if you are in that situation and there is no page number, then use the location number. And you will often find that these are much bigger numbers. So it's not going to be 157, it's more like 95,000 and something. But that's fine. What you're doing is you're pointing the reader to where you picked up your information from. So the location number instead of the page number, if that's what's necessary. And again, as we think about quotations, and they were going to be a major part of the session on plagiarism, but page numbers or location numbers need to be there at the end of a quote. Otherwise, you don't normally have to have them. So for journals, there is an element of, it's quite straightforward in as much as you have the names, the date, the title of the article, where it was found, and then the specific references. So you would have volume 26 issue 2 with the pages. You don't necessarily need the DOIs, although it's sometimes helpful to have that because it makes it easier for the examiner to be able to quickly follow the link to where you picked that article up from. It does not need a date when you accessed the article, because one of the gems about a journal is that once you have published in the journal, you are no longer able to edit that article. So once it's published, that's it, it's fixed. So a date is not required to show that you've looked for the most recent edition. Most journals also now have a link to citation details on the page with the article, and it's worth looking at. You will often have to try and find a version that is closest to the one that you are using, because they will often have several different formats, and you will also need to check that it actually fits with your local version of Harvard or MLA or whatever it is you're using. So it's there, it can be useful, but just be careful that you have to do a little bit of work to make sure that it is the right one for what you're doing. Okay, electronic sources. Again, we're starting in a very similar position as we have with many of the other referencing systems that we've talked about. So we start off with the author, followed by the date, followed by a title. Where it's then different is that you then identify the website, which in this case is Community Care, followed by the URL in full that you take from your browser. So I just cut and paste it straight away across, and the date that you accessed it, because one of the things about any sort of website is that there is no version control, so it's up to you to identify when you looked at it. I've had a situation where marking scripts where in the 10 days between submission and me starting to mark, a website had changed and what the student had was no longer consistent with what was on the website. So it's worth having that there as a way of protecting yourself. The alternative, and this is again as I mentioned before, when you talk about government documents, it's the government, it's the department at the beginning, followed by the date, followed by the title. They do ask in this situation that you identify the jurisdiction. So in this case it was England, on the basis that it would be very easy that you might be wanting to look at something comparative, for instance in Scotland or the US. So they do ask for the jurisdiction there. But as with the previous one, you then dive into a full URL and the date you accessed it. And again, accessing is important because the government will update statutory guidance in particular, but various papers do get updated, and they do have the date of last update on the front page of the piece of work concerned. So do check that date to make sure you understand how recent the publication is. Okay, legislation. This is one of the areas where there is quite a bit of variation between different universities. The way that the Open University Harvard system works is different to other universities. It is one of the way it departs from the standard Harvard approach. So it's always worth checking what your university is expecting, and particularly what they expect in terms of submissions within your department, because as I said at the beginning, different courses have different expectations. I've based this slide on Cite Them Right. If you go into Cite Them Right, there is a tab specifically for legislation, and it looks at whether it's statute, statutory instruments, whether it's green or white papers, whether it's Hansard or committee briefings. So you've got quite a range of different things there. A lot of it follows pretty much what you would expect in terms of an electronic book that we just discussed. Not book, my apologies, an electronic paper that we've just discussed. So if I'm putting in legislation, I might be talking about the Health and Social Care Act. They do expect the chapter on it. If you go to legislation.gov UK to the actual act you're looking at, it will tell you what chapter it is right at the top. So it is available. And again, you'd be expected to give the date that you accessed it, because legislation is being updated by the Government Office fairly regularly as new rules are agreed through Parliament, and a lot of it is only minor tweaks. You may well not even be aware that it was under discussion, so it is worth putting those dates. When you get to the in-text, it's fairly straightforward. Most people just expect to see Mental Health Act 1983. A few might look for Mental Health Act brackets 1983, but as I say, this is becoming a more common feature now. Alternatively, you might be putting in Section 3 of the Mental Health Act. If you were looking at a specific section, again, your bibliographic reference will say Mental Health Act 1983 Chapter 20, standard, available at, and your URL now is taking you, as you see at the end of the URL, straight to the page around 23, and again the date that it was accessed. Now, some universities like the jurisdiction in as a matter of course. The common convention is that if you are only looking at one jurisdiction, so for instance England, then it can be assumed that it will be England throughout. If, however, you are using more than one jurisdiction, so you might be looking at England and Scotland or England and Wales, you then have to specify on each occasion which jurisdiction the legislation relates to. So as soon as you bring in the second jurisdiction, jurisdictions have to appear against every piece of legislation in that assignment. Okay, so I've mentioned previously that there is Cite Them Right, which offers advice and detail on how to put a citation together with various worked examples. There are other sites out there, and I'm only going to pick out a couple. You've got Cite This For Me, which is a citation preparation tool, and also links to its own bibliography if you're prepared to have an account with them. Grammarly, been around for a while now, has a reputation already as a grammar checking service, but more recently has now included a plagiarism checking facility. So you can get your own results before putting it through the university, and what they often have is Turnitin, which is a plagiarism checker. So there are various options there. If you're using Cite Them Right, you will find that if you are part of a university that has access through Shibboleth, which is one of the library access portals, you will then find you can get into a full range of support material there. Just make sure you're selecting the correct referencing system, such as Harvard, from their list, because you will see there a huge list of options. And of course, as I said previously, a lot of publishers now do include citation tools against journal articles, against books and so on. Just do check that they conform to your university's guidance. Whilst this session was really focused on referencing, it would be remiss of me not to also look at the fact that I've done a session on good academic practice as well. And what we cover in good academic practice is not only how to set out quotations, what's anticipated in terms of a summary, but also how you should be identifying material that you use in a way that's clear that it's other people's work and not your own. This is important in terms of academic integrity, but it also shows your awareness of what other people are saying about your subject, which in itself is an important academic skill. If I was to summarise that session, when you're looking at quotations, do make sure that anything you quote is identified as such, using either apostrophes if it's short or as a separate paragraph. Each university will have its own way of wanting you to display that, albeit some might just say, be absolutely clear, it's not yours. What is consistent though is that at the end of the quotation you do need to include the page number or location number, and it's surprising how many people forget or put it in the wrong place. You can put the author and the date at the beginning or end of the quotation, that doesn't matter. You can put the author and the date in brackets alongside the page number, again that's fine, but what they all have to do is have the page number at the end, and you'd be surprised how many people don't do it. So this really sums up my session on referencing. Please do look at websites like Cite Them Right, which include a wealth of resources around referencing, but also have some guidance around what is good practice in terms of framing quotations. Do look at reference managers. They're always worth having because they avoid the accidental errors. And I'm a great fan of using them once you've got used to it. And finally, don't forget your university library will have a wealth of resources on this. Often not as accessible as a 30-minute YouTube clip, but what they have are the standards that they expect you to follow, so do be aware of them. As I said, often it's Harvard, and whilst there are lots of flavours of Harvard, they're all pretty similar, and you're unlikely to be criticised for using one that's slightly different to everybody else's. Where you will be criticised is if you're not using it consistently or clearly. And ultimately, referencing is about showing the reader where they can find what you're using in terms of developing your thinking and explaining what your argument. So referencing is not a drudge, it's not a problem, it's actually you demonstrating in more than just words how you have come to the conclusions you've done, and that they are academically robust and relevant. And at the end of the day, that's what your examiners are looking for. So I hope you've enjoyed this clip. I'm sorry to say it's terribly full of slide content, which makes it a little bit harder, I know. But I hope you also take the opportunity to look at some of the other sessions on this channel, and please do subscribe, so as I put more up you will find out about them. So thank you very much, and I hope you all the success with your studies. Thank you. Bye.